Kia ora koutou katoa, nei rā te mihi a koutou, mō tēnei te rā o te Kingitanga, ki te whare wānanga Waikato, ko Maui Hudson tuku ingoa, nō te Whakatōhea o te rā, ko hoki te kaihautu o te matapunenga o te Kotahi. So just greetings to everyone that's here for Kingitanga Day, joining in on these sessions. I'm here to talk about the Te Nohonga Kaitiaki guidelines for genomic research. I've got a few slides, so I will just get those set up. Just take the opportunity before we do that to acknowledge the Kingitanga and all that the Kingitanga does for the Motu, and the relationship that the Kingitanga and Waikato Tainui have with the University of Waikato, and the connection between those entities and the Te Kotahi Research Institute. So the name draws on the legacy of Robert Te Kotahi Mahuta, and also as a reference to our role ki te whakakotahi i ngā whakaaro, i ngā rangahau mō ngā iwi o te whare wānanga Waikato. So, you know, its role in supporting research across the broader university catchment. And this project, which I'll be talking about, is in some ways a reflection of one of those things. Let me just share the screen here, if I can get this up in the right sort of way. Kia ora. So this project was one that was around developing guidelines around genomic research for Taonga species. You'll see here the team that was involved in the project: myself, Phil Wilcox, Jason Nika, Chris Battershill, Matt Stott, Ari Thompson, Bobby Brooks, and Lisa Woolbrick was a student on the project in its early stages. The name itself, and thinking about Te Nohonga Kaitiaki, it's really referring to the role that Kaitiaki and or mana whenua have in managing Māori interests in biological samples or genetic resources, and data relating to Taonga species across the full spectrum of activities, from samples being collected to samples being stored, from the way data is curated to the way data is shared. And these are all activities that emerge from us deciding to engage in research. And often the decision to get involved in genomic research might be done initially because of the way it might support a biodiversity activity or a conservation outcome. And so and engaging with genomic researchers around those sorts of projects, we're generating data, we're generating samples that might have a different purpose in the future. And that was one of the things that was highlighted as a concern. It's something that emerged from in the context of some other genomic guidelines that have been created, been involved in developing Te Mata Era, the guidelines for genomic research with Māori, and the He Tangata Keitua guidelines for biobanking with Māori. And so the movement from thinking about how this operates in the context of working with humans to the context of working with Taonga species is what this was the shift that was made for this project. But it wasn't just that previous work that informed what we did. We had a look at a number of different sorts of documents and frameworks which Māori had been involved in putting together that related to things like Māori ethics or bioethics or tikanga in relation to genetic modification, Māori ethical frameworks for genetic research, work that had been done around biotechnology, some of the ideas emerging from Y262, how Māori perspectives are incorporated into decision-making protocols for the Environmental Protection Authority. And so when we looked at these bits of work, you know, we commonly saw them talking about whakapapa, Māori, Kaitiakitanga, and mana. And so anything that gets put together would logically reference those types of, those sorts of concepts. So part of the, I guess part of what we're doing is thinking about what are the concepts that are relevant, what are the Māori concepts that would inform the way we think good research practice looks like when working with Taonga species. And then the other component is really thinking about what sorts of issues do we need to address in that context as well. And through workshops that we ran with Māori groups and with researchers, identified a range of issues. From the mana whenua side, expectations of consultation and what they look like. And often that was paralleled through the researchers who thought consultation was important, but were often confused about who they would consult with. Mana whenua were interested in what mutually beneficial relationships would look like. They wanted to ensure that there was a meaningful involvement of Kaitiaki in projects. Getting to the point where there's mutual understanding between parties was something that was shared across the board. Māori groups were interested in the protection of Māori rights and interests and control over samples and data. And also wanted to know the way that these rights would translate into fair and equitable benefit sharing. And as well as highlighting the importance of communication and feedback. From the researcher side, there's often outside of the consultation activities, really thinking about wanting to know more about how mātauranga could enhance the project. And there were challenges in really understanding and incorporating Kaitiaki priorities into projects, and what sat within a project and what sat without a project, and how they could recognize existing intellectual property and think about ways of sharing new intellectual property, and just what sorts of expectations there were around maintaining relationships over a longer period of time. So one of the the discussions that we had with Māori groups, and we were trying to think about Taonga species and really understand what a Taonga was for us. What's our foundation, our cultural foundation for understanding Taonga, and the relationship between Taonga and these other words or these other concepts which people had identified as being important. And so those concepts are reflected there in the diagram, and we were able to articulate it by talking about Taonga as a reflection of Māori, recognition of whakapapa, an acknowledgement of mana, an affirmation of wairua, an application of tapu, and an assertion of Kaitiakitanga. So that's our way of talking to the relationship between a Taonga, these concepts, when we start thinking about Taonga species. And there were these particular sorts of, we call them cultural logics or thought processes that emerged around, or ideas that were formed around these ideas of Taonga, Māori, and Kaitiakitanga. And so Taonga being something treasured or having value to Māori, that it is something that's tangible and intangible. And so when we think about Taonga species, it can comprise both indigenous species and indigenous biota, but it might also include introduced species as well. The Taonga assessment, or the different ways in which might think about things that would be considered a Taonga, so this provenance in relation to you, what sorts of opportunities emerge from its use, and its utility in terms of the different sorts of uses it might have. There were also statements made around biota being Taonga, so all the microorganisms and things that we don't necessarily see, but we know that they're a part of the environment within which the Taonga we can see live. Those exist as Taonga, and bioactives as a component of the species itself can also be recognized as Taonga too. And so when people were talking about Māori, they were often talking about the modi of the species. And so sometimes that meant the preservation of the species itself. Sometimes it was talking about the modi in relation to the biodiversity and its function within a broader ecosystem. And so the preservation of that role within the ecosystem was a component of it. It was also connected to the preservation of mātauranga that related to knowledge about those species and their roles. And we also talked about the microbiome being a part of the Māori of the Taonga. So all of those small elements that contribute to the health of the Taonga species is contributing to the Māori of that Taonga. And the conversations around Kaitiakitanga, we're really thinking about it in terms of responsibilities of sustainability and sustainability of the Taonga in terms of the way that it enhances environments, or how Māori enhances environments, sustainability as a Taonga, so that whakapapa maintain, and in terms of whakapapa, it maintains relationships. And so the cultural relationships we have with the Taonga is important. And then sustainability for Taonga. And so mana, our aspirations around mana and ability to create value from things is another element of sustainability. But the sustainability of Taonga was, Taonga could only be used for those kinds of commercial purposes if it didn't affect the sustainability as a cultural Taonga. So its preservation in the first instance, our ability to use it for our cultural purposes, and if there was opportunities beyond that for other sorts of values to be expressed, then that was the time that that could happen. So there are these other comments made about Taonga in relation to genomic research, and that Taonga is values-based and the values are broad and they change across time and place. The Taonga is something that's treasured and therefore needs to be managed and or protected. And at times it may need to be restricted. And as the Taonga becomes these other pieces, which themselves independently become Taonga, there may be the need for different kaitiaki for these different elements at different times. So this the kaitiaki for the species and where it sits in the environment or on the whenua may be a different kaitiaki from the one that looks after the samples that have been collected and are now sitting within a laboratory somewhere. And that might be different from where the data sits in a different place. And that might require a different sort of skill or expertise or kaitiaki to be involved in that process. So this, in terms of thinking about Kaitiakitanga, I think here just really reflecting the same ideas that have been expressed before around how the kaitiaki responsibilities relate to Taonga and the sustainability of those Taonga. And as I mentioned before, that those can only be used for commercial purposes only if it doesn't affect its presence in the environment or sustainability as cultural Taonga or the role of kaitiaki. And this becomes an interesting element as, we have opportunities in different ways to engage in research and innovation activities, some of which can lead into commercial spaces. And even if these are led by Māori groups or iwi groups, there's still this tension at the intersection between commercial and cultural interests. There's also needs to think about what sort of capacity and capability we have to engage not only in the research activity, but the commercial opportunities that follow that. And those are, so these are both skills in a technical, operational, and financial spaces. How do we access resources to support end-to-end investment around both the research and commercialization phases? What kinds of ways can we deal with intellectual property to both allow us to claim things that are possible, but stop misappropriation of our mātauranga? And if you have the opportunity, there's another session which we were involved with helping put together around intellectual property in Te Ao Māori. That's also been hosted on Kingitanga Day, and is really interesting to see Māori groups that are actively engaged in research and innovation processes thinking deeply about the way in which they can address the intellectual property issues from a from a real Te Ao Māori point of view, and how that can translate down into commercial agreements and ongoing engagement. So these were all of the sorts of conversations and ideas that people shared with us as we were talking about the things that were important in terms of putting together some guidelines. And so when we get down to the guidance itself, it starts to shape together in this kind of way. We established we made use of some guiding principles. And these guiding principles were ones that have been developed through the Te Mataira project around genomic research with Māori, which talked about these three elements. So in the course of a research project, there's a whole lot of decisions get made, and most of those decisions are being made by the researchers rather than the whānau. And so we want researchers to make decisions that are consistent with these ideas. Kia tau te wairu o te tangata, kia pūmau te mana o te tangata, and kia hiki te mauri o te kaupapa. And so these things relate to the level of comfort that the individuals and the communities have in the use of that material going forward. That the level of control that individuals have either through consent or the community has through involvement in governance processes, that is retained through not only the course of the project, but also future projects. And that all of the uses and the ways in which the data and the samples contribute to all the kinds of potential activities is done in a way that maintains the mauri of the kaupapa, and that the level of integrity that sits around these sort of decisions and processes is kept at an optimal level. And so these guiding principles had been discussed in the context of humans, but we felt still applied when we're thinking about the systems that sit around Taonga species as well. But we also identified some specific operating principles that were unique to this kind of context of thinking about Taonga species. And so these ideas about he whakapapa tō te taonga, he mauri tō te taonga, and he kaitiaki tō te taonga need to be understood and inform the actions and activities that take place. So taonga have relationships with people in place, he whakapapa tō te taonga. Taonga are essential components of an ecosystem, he mauri tō te taonga. And taonga are protected through intentional actions. And so he kaitiaki tō te taonga. You know, the kaitiaki has a particular role in terms of ensuring that taonga is able to remain and be well and be healthy within its environment. But that action is an intentional one, and there are responsibilities which kaitiaki have to ensure that takes place. And so the principles sit behind, in a general sense, the sorts of decisions and the sorts of the key kawa or ideas that will inform actions. And then we have an engagement framework that really thinks about the responsiveness and some important things to be talking through in the context of the project. Some things that need to be thought about in relation to the organization. So what tends to happen is we have a conversation about a project. That's where samples are collected, data is collected. But then when the project ends, the material sits within the organization, and then the organization itself takes responsibility for it, not the project team. And so this transition from the project team, transition of mana in some ways from a project team to an organization, and then sometimes outside the organization is something that we have to think about. And so thinking about the project, the organization, and then a system level responsiveness, we thought was important for people to be aware of as they're starting to engage in these types of activities. And so what we've done for each of each of these segments is think about the components involved in relation to project responsiveness, sort of things around engagement and communication, the level of involvement, the intellectual contribution of mana whenua and Māori to the project, and then sort of mutual understanding around the project outcomes. Those are all things that, you know, really need to be talked about and discussed and ensure happen leading into a project. And then these elements around organization responsiveness, which still you want to talk about, you know, in that formative stage, but really thinking about what will data access and governance look like, what does capacity building look like, how do we embed relationships, all of these elements around things like benefit sharing and sample storage and uses, they also need to be included in these conversations. We've got some sorts of questions that prompt thinking in those spaces. And then in terms of system level responsiveness, and, you know, sometimes these are things that a little bit relate to broader ideas or broader parts of the context, but, you know, who are going to be the end users for this information? So it's being generated for a particular purpose. Where might that extend to? You know, how is the project being funded, and what sorts of implications or rules sitting around that funding might exist that kind of affect what can be done with it? Are there international agreements that this work will be subject to? Now, some of those might be things like the Nagoya Protocol, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. These are things that are supposed to strengthen and enforce Indigenous rights, but there might be other types of things, trade-related protections around TRIPS, or things around plant variety rights, or things around the Convention of Biological Diversity, which push in different sorts of directions. And so being aware of those in advance is useful. And that also relates to the sorts of networks or consortia the research team are a part of, because those are their friends and colleagues who they may be wanting to share information or data or learnings with. And so understanding what those relationships look like is also an important activity. So what we've tried to do through the guidelines is also then try and point in a direction around some types of things. So, you know, for the researchers and research organizations, how they might think about engaging with Māori, and when different sorts of engagement are important. So whether that's with individuals or hapu, where that might happen with Māori commercial or non-commercial entities, when runanga or collective iwi entities in this are the right vehicle to work with, and the sorts of things where, you know, when multiple iwi will be necessary. And, you know, when we think about some of the species, and these might be, you know, sort of some of our ika, if we think about tāmure and how that's kind of generally available around the motu, what's the pan-Māori interest that applies to those sorts of taonga species? We've also tried to identify some of the places where you can find other guidance documents that would be useful for kind of building understanding either of people in the community or researchers and scientists, just so they can get a better idea about the range of advice that does sit out there and can be used to improve understanding and capacity. And so our research team wish to acknowledge the participants, stakeholders, and mana whenua who contributed to the project and the development of these guidelines. And we'd also like to acknowledge that this work has been fully funded by Genomics Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. If anyone is interested in getting a copy of this, a copy of these guidelines, you can feel free to get in touch with us at the Te Kotahi Research Institute, either by phone or via rangahau at waikato.ac.nz. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.